So I'm Caroline Quinn. I work for a company called Autocase, and we have a product called CarbonSite. CarbonSite is a portfolio scale decarbonization planning tool. And we've put this out into the market and been collecting some feedback from our users. And some of the feedback that we've received is that sustainability professionals doing decarbonization planning need help understanding what the actual impact of their decarbonization measures are in a very cost-effective and quick way. So traditional methods to estimate the decarbonization impact of measures would be to use static guides or different workbooks and templates that you might have to estimate these impacts, or to do custom energy studies on individual properties. At the portfolio scale, though, those individual studies are not really realistic. They're overly expensive and time-consuming. So we have been looking at how to make that process faster and more affordable. Hence me and the innovation team at CarbonSite, trying to make that estimation process a little bit more affordable. So we started our journey on the innovation side with parametric energy modeling. So just trying to break a property down into a certain number of features based on building performance values. And that certainly got us a little ways, having parametric energy modeling becoming more accessible. But then we found that people want to be able to run those models even faster, so we started building surrogate models. Surrogate models are AI-based models, and they let you run, or essentially run, an energy model much faster and get an instant energy estimate for a certain performance value set for a building. But these surrogate models didn't really tell you what the most important features for a particular property were. And so we built interpretability models. Interpretability models highlight the most important features of a building that will impact our target variables. So all of this saying, this is kind of what we do on the innovation side at Autocase. Today, though, I am going to talk about a white paper that we've just put together. So we do lots of research, building our AI models. We do lots of batch runs of energy models, lots of assessment of how our AI models are functioning. But every once in a while we think, hey, we should just try and answer a question that we've heard in industry and kind of play around with some of our data and explore a little bit. So that's where the idea for this white paper came about. So this white paper is trying to answer the question of post-pandemic, there is a much higher trend of work from home, and therefore there are office spaces that are sitting somewhat vacant or have lower utilization rates than pre-pandemic. And office users or consumers of office space, people who lease office space or own office space, are wondering if they should consolidate their offices, especially if they have offices in the same location physically. Or if they should revert to a 3-day work week, perhaps. So we decided to use our parametric energy modeling to just create a batch run and explore some of these different scenarios. So we created 4 hypothetical portfolios, and each portfolio we put through 5 different office utilization scenarios, and this gave us the data for our white paper. So our 4 portfolios were based off of 10 offices in 4 different locations. The 4 different locations, we had 2 cold climates and 2 warm climates, and each of our warm and cold climates had a relatively dirty grid and a relatively clean grid. Within each of the portfolios, like I said, we had 10 offices, and the 10 offices represented about 3.3 million square feet in total. And this was based off the understanding that we wanted about 160 square feet per person in these portfolios, and that the portfolios would be for a 20,000 person company, so quite a large company. The actual 10 offices in each of the portfolios, we kind of randomly varied building features. So we varied the type of mechanical system, the type of heating fuel, window-to-wall ratios, ceiling heights, etc. And we won't get into that because it's just a lot of detail. But ultimately, we ended up with a variety of buildings that had different energy use throughout them. So on the left-hand side, you can see just the energy used across each of the buildings that we were assessing. This is the baseline energy use at 100% utilization rate. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the cost and carbon. So there's a compounding effect just based on the grid situation. So they don't exactly mirror each other. And our baseline case, just a little bit more detail. So we understood that post-pandemic, utilization rate is 31% of office space. So that represents employees coming to work in person about 1.5 days per week. We assumed that the office spaces were open 5 days a week at baseline, and then we did scale plug loads accordingly. So we also kind of scaled those down to 31% at baseline. These scenarios that we explored and ultimately ran models for each building under each scenario were varied. And in each scenario, we were really playing with 3 features of the building. We were playing with the occupant density, we were playing with the plug loads, and we were playing with the number of days the office was open, so either 3 days or 5 days. So in scenario 1, we assumed that the office user was going to change to a 3-day work week, and that employees would come in at the same rate they're currently coming in. So 1.5 days per week per employee. In a slight variation of that first scenario, we assume that if the employer or the office user reduced to 3 days a week, that employees would come in a little bit less often. So we said basically it would work out to about 1 day per week per employee, just due to the hassle of not being able to go any of the 5 days of the week. In scenario 2, we explored a mandatory 3-day attendance and the office being open 5 days a week. So it's a coordinated mandatory 3-day-a-week scenario. So that's actually an increase in office utilization. And we wanted to put a couple of these in just because it's certainly part of the conversation, requiring people to return to work in office. So we wanted to have a couple of those scenarios. Scenario 3 is another one of those scenarios. So it's a 3-day per week operation of the office space with required 3-day attendance. Scenario 4 is a consolidation or an amalgamation of office space. So it explored maintaining the 1.5 days per week per employee and looking at all of the 10 offices that you might have in a single place and consolidating it down to the minimum square footage you would require. So in this case, we consolidated down to 3 office buildings. And in scenario 4, we selected the 3 newest buildings, so the 3 most modern buildings. Alternatively, in scenario 5, it's also a consolidation at the same post-pandemic utilization rates. But instead of optimizing for the newest buildings, we selected the buildings through a supplemental energy model batch run that we did. We selected the buildings that were the most cost-effective to operate. So those are our scenarios. Sorry, it was a little dense there. Ultimately, we found that scenarios 1, 4, and 5 consistently reduced energy use and GHG emissions. Here we're looking at GHG emissions. We looked at all the different metrics. Of course, these scenarios would reduce GHGs because they all saw reductions in utilization. Scenarios 2 and 3, of course, increased. And what we found interesting and thought we might like if we had a little bit more spare time in the future to explore would be at what point of increased utilization do we have to offset by consolidating offices, and at what rate do you have to consolidate offices to justify increased utilization? But that was not included in this. Some of the interesting facts that we found about our results were that scenario 1B consistently saw savings, but there was differences in savings even within a single portfolio. So for single properties, there was a difference in energy impact of that single measure. And it ranged from 11.2% to 19.8%. So that's a relatively large impact change for a particular measure. And it really justified to us the value of doing individual modeling, building modeling, because a static measure, model, or guide would only have a single value assigned. So by doing the individual bottom-up energy modeling, we were able to look at the impact of a particular scenario on each and every building and understand it. Similarly, metrics, energy, cost, and carbon also varied. So they didn't necessarily follow just the energy impact wasn't the exact same for the cost and the carbon, of course, because the grid has different emission factors and costs. And those varied by 1 or 2%. So not massive, but still relevant to consider the metric that you are trying to optimize for. So that was kind of what was interesting about the non-consolidated scenarios. In terms of the consolidated scenarios, 5 certainly outperformed 4 in all of the portfolios and for all of the buildings. What we found interesting about this was that it wasn't necessarily a newer building with a better envelope and slightly better efficiencies on the HVAC that seemed to matter. It was actually heat pumps that made a really large difference. And even heat pump efficiency ratios that were less than the cost increase ratio of electricity outperformed buildings without heat pumps. So this was true in Boston and LA, where we saw higher electricity costs, which we found quite interesting. So this analysis was possible because we used parametric energy modeling. The whole process of creating our data took about 20 minutes. So we created and ran 240 energy models in 20 minutes, and those were actual energy model runs. That's, I think, relatively quick for energy model creation and running, especially to represent all of these different buildings. With the AI that we're looking to include as well, this time would drop out to just seconds. But even with the energy model runs, it's a relatively approachable time investment to get a more detailed analysis on a building by building basis of how different scenarios or measures can impact the carbon intensity of your buildings, without having to incur these huge costs of custom analyses for individual buildings. So this case study is certainly not meant to indicate that scenario 5 would be the best case in all scenarios. It's more so to indicate that it was very fast and easy to create this data set and to customize it to any particular portfolio so that you can get a more accurate assessment of scenarios and decarbonization measures that you're exploring for a portfolio. Thank you very much.